Hello, I'm Kevin Fandel, and I'm an associate professor of business law at the Fox School of Business, Temple University. Prior to joining Fox, I spent over a decade working on trade-related matters for the federal government and for private law firms. And that's why I'm with you today, to talk to you about the relationship between international trade and the global health pandemic. This is a speaker series about how COVID-19 is affecting key aspects of business and globalization. With these short videos, we hope to provide you with valuable and practical insights about industry and commerce that will help you to understand and better navigate the turbulent waters ahead. This series is sponsored by the Temple University Center for International Business Education and Research, CIBER, which is housed here at the Fox School of Business. In this session, I will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on international trade, including the status of the global trade war, changes in trade patterns, and access to goods such as medical equipment. I will also, at the end, provide you with a few predictions about what I believe we can expect when we reach the other side of the global health pandemic. So with that, let's get started. Let's start with the trade war. Remember that? Well, it's still going on. The trade war is largely being waged between the United States and China, and it hasn't cooled off very much. There are also other key trading partners who are playing in this trade war, including Europe and India. And the trade war itself, prior to the pandemic, had already caused significant economic damage and was having the effect of reducing overall global growth forecasts. Now, when it's combined with the global health pandemic, we are seeing a severe prediction of reduced global economic growth. So these effects are long-term, and the trade war and the pandemic together are worsening our expectations for the future. Now, to put this into stark detail, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, just released their forecast for global economic growth in 2020, and they have suggested that this growth will be half of what it was expected to be just a couple months ago. They are predicting economic growth of 1.5%, with nearly every country suffering an economic slowdown. Now, this isn't just the global health pandemic. This is the trade war that I just mentioned, as well as some other key factors happening in the global economy, such as the failure of the UK and the Eurozone to reach agreement post-Brexit on how those two regions will trade with one another. Now, just before this pandemic began, weren't US and Chinese trade negotiators reaching some kind of a deal to end the trade war? Well, again, not exactly. What happened is that there was extraordinary frustration on the part of both the US and China with the ongoing and increasingly painful tariffs that were making it much more expensive for US consumers to receive our goods at a reasonable cost, for US manufacturers to receive the components we need to make other goods because of the tariffs, and also for China, which had to shift its sources of supply for things like agriculture, which it had previously sourced principally from the United States. So there was an exhaustion appearing on both sides of the trade war. However, the Phase 1 trade deal you might have heard about, which was signed in January of 2020, only took a very small step in the direction of resolving these tariffs. And in fact, it wasn't even relieving pressure, it simply prevented one group of tariffs from going into effect and reduced the tariff on a small subset of Chinese imports by half. So the overall effect has been relatively small. To give you some numbers here, prior to the trade war, the average US tariff on Chinese imports was around 3%. And the average Chinese tariff on US exports was around 8%. Today, both countries are hovering between 19 and 20% on each other's goods. So you can imagine the extraordinarily higher cost that importers are having to pay, and ultimately consumers are going to have to suffer. So this is not the end of the war that many businesses and economists have been hoping for. Now, even in the midst of pre-pandemic world, there was a lot of push to try to end this trade war. But now there's even more push by the business community to relieve the pressure that these tariffs are causing on already suffering firms. And they've asked for the tariffs to be removed, at least temporarily. The Trump administration, as of the time of this recording, has not taken any steps to remove the tariffs. And in fact, they have expressed a desire to keep those tariffs in place. However, they have taken a few steps in other areas to relieve some pressure. I'll mention just two of those. One is that the Trump administration allows specific companies to petition the federal government for an exception to the tariffs. So they can come in and ask for relief for their particular type of import, whatever it is that they're trying to enter, principally from China. The problem that we've seen in this area is that many of the businesses petitioning the government are not asking to remove tariffs, but they're asking to put on more tariffs. This seems a bit counterintuitive. Why would you shoot yourself in the foot when you're already suffering? The reason for this in many cases is because this pandemic has made it very difficult for a lot of businesses to survive. They are even less competitive than they were before. So for certain sectors, certain industries, they are looking for additional protection against competing imports. So this is a bit off of what we had hoped for in terms of tariff relief. Now, the second thing is an executive order that we expect President Trump to sign, which would have the major effect of freezing tariff collection for 90 days. So that means that importers would not have to pay the assigned tariffs on their goods for the next 90 days. It's giving them some breathing room here, which could be very, very helpful for them. And it would allow them to be even more competitive. There are a couple caveats here. One is that this only applies to MFN, or most favored nation countries. So we're not talking about folks who we're not trading with. We're talking about folks who are within the World Trade Organization that we have existing trade relationships with. That would not include China. Even though China is a member of the World Trade Organization, the tariffs that have been levied under the trade war are exempt from this executive order. It would also not include any of the global steel and aluminum tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs as they're known. These tariffs are excluded from this executive order. So the relief is not going to the principal places of concern here. That's one of the big, or two of the big caveats with this executive order, which we expect to be signed promptly. One positive takeaway that we can yield from the trade war, at least now in the light of this global health pandemic, is a new realization of the importance of global trade and an understanding of how delicate it is. Much like dominoes, when we start to adjust barriers, such as adding tariffs or creating the rhetoric behind the trade war, we start to see that the entire system can break down very easily. This is particularly problematic right now in the time when we need trade to continue functioning. We need to depend upon our neighbors to receive the supplies that we need. All of the problems that we're seeing in trade right now have their roots in trade relations that started back in 2018, the breakdown in trade relations that started back in 2018 between the US, China, and many of our other key partners. And we see this very clearly today with respect to medical supplies. The US imports about $22 billion worth of medical products, from face masks to gloves to ventilators. And a lot of these components, the majority, in fact, of either the finished product or the pieces that go into the product, in the case of ventilators, come from China. Now, prior to the trade war, our tariffs on medical products from China were zero or very close to zero. The 2018 tariffs that were put in place on China had the effect of significantly increasing the cost of those products. Now, the increased cost made it very difficult for many of our medical facilities in the United States to acquire those supplies. And maybe they weren't as concerned about this 6 months ago, that they didn't have excess supply of face masks and gloves. But as all of us have been reading about in the news, these are creating severe shortages right now. The people who need them most, our first responders, our frontline health workers, they cannot get the goods that they need, the masks, the gloves, the ventilators, largely because they were cut off from access due to these high tariffs and other reasons. Now, some good news here. China has been airlifting in or flying in millions more masks and gloves and other medical supplies in response to our shortage. So as China begins to overcome the pandemic, they are helping to address needs of countries still in the midst of it, like the United States. But there's some more bad news on the horizon. There are export restrictions that some countries are placing on the export of medical supplies. So Europe, for example, India, these countries' governments are placing restrictions on exports of needed medical goods in order to keep their domestic supplies available for their domestic markets. It sounds terrible. Why would you interrupt global trade when there's demand and need for these goods in other parts of the world? But it's actually quite a common thing to do in a time of crisis. If you think back to World War II, we would have export restrictions on things like steel. We don't want to sell steel to other countries when we may need it to produce airplanes and tanks and guns and such. So we would restrict the export of that essential good. Today, the war is against a virus, and the guns and airplanes and tanks that we're using are in the form of rubber gloves and N95 masks. So countries are putting restrictions on exports of those goods. Right now, there are about 54 countries that have done so. India, in particular, is a major exporter of pharmaceutical products. We bring a lot of our medicines in from India. One of the medicines that India produces is an anti-malarial drug that has been showing great promise in helping to cut the symptoms of COVID-19. And that anti-malarial drug is now on the export restriction list of India. Good news is that other pharmaceutical companies in other countries, such as Teva in Israel, is also producing the same anti-malarial drug, and they are exporting it. So that's a very positive thing. One last update that I'll mention here is that there's another executive order being considered by the Trump administration today. It is a Buy America executive order, and it has to do with the pharmaceutical industry. So this crisis has shown that we've had some difficulty in getting access to medicines. As I just mentioned, we import many of those medicines from abroad. So the executive order would require any pharmaceutical company that wants to sell to the federal government, state and local governments, public institutions, they would have to locate in the United States. So we're trying to force foreign pharmaceutical companies to come back into the United States if they want a piece of the public sector market, which is obviously a huge, huge market. I would argue this is probably bad timing to be thinking about something like this. In addition, it likely violates our obligations under an agreement, an international agreement that we have within the World Trade Organization called the Government Procurement Agreement. Within that agreement, we had promised to allow any pharmaceutical companies to bid on government requests for medicines. So it wouldn't matter where you're located in the world, we would treat you the same way as we treat our domestic manufacturers. So if this executive order is signed, not only is it bad timing for our access to medicines now, it's also potentially violating our obligations under the World Trade Organization. Now, that's a lot of information that I just threw at you. So let me highlight a few key takeaways. First of all, the trade war is waging on with no end in sight. It has not stopped because of this pandemic. However, of course, it has affected global supply chains. It has affected our access to goods in many other ways. But the underlying trade war, the tariffs that we've been imposing around the world continue. This was bad for economic growth before the global health pandemic, and it is downright destructive now. It needs to come to an end if we are to have any hope of restarting the engine of economic growth on the other end of this crisis. The rapid spread of COVID-19 has revealed just how important trade and global supply chains are to the maintenance of our economic system. Not only our access to medical goods, but to all the components that we are going to need to kickstart our economy. Sectors that are mainly affected by the virus are, we read about in the news all the time, restaurants, retail companies. They are laying off workers in the hundreds and thousands day by day. Unemployment rates are skyrocketing, especially in those sectors. But trade also shows us that there are sectors behind the scenes that are being affected by the trade war as well, including global logistics companies, cargo companies moving container ships, with many of those containers now arriving half full or even empty. Airlines, of course, the tourism and transit industry. All of these sectors are being dramatically upended as a result of the pandemic, but also because of our actions to restrict trade. Our perception of global trade is changing, or at least it should be. The pandemic is helping us to realize in many cases just how delicate the trade system is and how important effective trade policies are to keep our system in place. The virus will be beaten in time, but the effects on the economy are long-lasting and severe. And our view of the global economy, when we're through all of this, is going to be quite different. Now, I promised you a few predictions before we close out this short lecture. So let me suggest to you what I believe we can expect after COVID-19. First, coming back online after the virus ends is going to be very difficult and very slow. The effects, of course, are going to give us the worst economic year in modern history, as 2020 is really going to show such low economic growth. But I expect those impacts to continue into 2021 as consumers are more hesitant, even after the virus, to go out to crowded shopping malls, to eat out in restaurants. And of course, they're going to be much more restricted because they've spent many of their savings accounts on necessary supplies to get through this crisis. Many, many thousands have lost their jobs as a result of this crisis. So they're not going to have the means to get out there and kickstart this economy right away. There's going to be a need for more dramatic government intervention here as a social safety net providing for consumers' well-being is one part, but also having that stimulus, providing the economy with a jump start is really the only way that we're going to start moving those wheels of capitalism once again. Many firms, especially those that demand physical presence of some kind, think about, again, restaurants and retail organizations, will have closed up, gone bankrupt. And others that are surviving are likely taking out significant debt in order to do so. The global economy after the virus is likely to be much leaner than the one that we saw just a few months ago. Companies are also going to start changing the way that they think about the global economy. Many are moving out of China, and this started even before the pandemic, but many are trying to find new sources of supply. I don't believe they're suddenly going to come back to the US due to a variety of reasons, mainly high cost in doing so, but they will start to spread out and look for new areas to source their components, to source their goods from. And this may mean not a elimination of global supply chain, but in fact, I would argue that it will create new avenues for a more diverse global supply chain, as we want to have Plan B and Plan C in place should we see the effects on the supply chain like this happen with the next crisis once again. One more thing that I think is likely to change is our access to goods that we now expect to arrive on our doorstep in the same day that we order them is likely going to slow down a little bit. Companies like Amazon, who are struggling to keep up already in this system, are likely to lose some of their momentum as we move away from just-in-time production and perhaps move back to an inventory model where companies house more goods in their regional warehouses rather than simply ordering and expecting the goods to arrive very, very quickly thanks to the efficiency of global supply chains. That is likely to change in the very near future. We may go back a little bit away from the speedy, efficient, lean model of production and sale that we had before. The global infrastructure that we've built over the past several decades is still there. It still operates, and it will still be there at the end of this pandemic. But that global infrastructure has been under threat since the start of the trade war, as we tear down our trade relationships with our friends and our foes alike, and as we question the value of international trade institutions like the World Trade Organization. One thing that I think we need to focus on right now in order to ensure a successful recovery from the pandemic and from the economic recession that it has caused is we need to focus on how to rebuild those trade relationships and how do we want this global economy to look on the other end of a global health crisis like the one that we're suffering now. I hope that our policymakers are thinking about this and considering ways to protect consumers and producers alike, but also to protect that global international infrastructure that we've put in place. That is the one way to ensure a positive recovery from this pandemic. With that, I thank you for paying attention. Thank you for your interest, and I wish you all good health and safety. I'm Kevin Fandel. See you next time.